This is going to be a poemy video. I think this is probably the only poem I feel totally confident talking about, so I probably won't do any more of these for the foreseeable future. But this is about the Seafarer, and the Seafarer is what we now call a particular 10th century poem, probably my favourite early medieval poem for various reasons. And when it comes to Old English literature, I'm more of a medical textbook kind of person, which is why I haven't really done these before. But someone suggested a poem video via Jackson Crawford, and I thought, why not? This is, an interesting topic, and I thought I'd go for the Seafarer. The first reason I like it is a really surface level thing, but I love how descriptive it is. So the first part of the poem is a man recounting his days alone on the sea, and he describes that lifestyle in a way that's really sensory. So even if it's impossible for a modern person to completely tune into the poem on a sort of cultural level, we can empathise with the speaker on a sensory level, and I'll read a short bit just to delve into that. That Simon ne wart, the him on fold on feiros limpeth, which arm chauri is kaldne sa winter wonade, ratchon lastum, winnemagum bedroren, behongen thrim yichelum, heil shurum flaug, tharich neje hyrde, butan hlimmon sa is kaldne wai, Huilum ylvete song, dydage meto gomene, ganetes hlaudur on whilpon sway, for a hlautur wera, mau singende, for a medudrinke, stormas thar stan klivu beltan, thar him staurn on quath, isi fedra, full of that aurn bejal uri fedra. And I think this is a real anchoring point when I read the poem, because waves sort of bashing against cliffs and the feeling of being in really heavy hail with bits of hail whacking into you and the chill in the air, and all those bird species which presumably behave the same way now as they did back then, all these feelings are accessible to a modern person. If you go to the right place at the right time, you will experience these things. The author is describing all of this to contrast it to how people live on land and how fortunate they are to live on land, how warm they're able to be, and how people on land aren't short of things to eat and drink. And specifically he's talking about people in large towns, on Borgum. So he's not necessarily envying the average farmer. One interpretation is that he's comparing himself to somebody right at the other end of that spectrum. As far as he's concerned, being at sea is the most remote and isolated situation you can be in. And being in the middle of a big town with people around you and wine to drink is the most content situation you can be in. And the more it goes on, the more we realise his relationship with the sea is complicated. He starts talking about the passing of the seasons on land, and as the seasons pass and get warmer, we see that he's yearning for the sea. He wants to be on the waves, looking for foreign countries and exploring the corners of the world. And he says, Forthon nis thas modlong, mon over eordan, ne his givene thas god, ne in jaude to thas hwat, ne in his dadum to thas deur, ne him his druten to thas hold, that he are his savore sorje nabbe to hon hine druten je don wille. The unpleasantness he's described is just part of the lifestyle. We start to realise that he's not forced to be out on the sea living this hard life. He thinks that this life is better than a life on land. And it reads to me like the warmer the seasons get, the more he needs to be in the sea, the less comfortable he feels on land. What's comfortable to most people is mentally uncomfortable to him. And this reminds me of a concept that I mentioned in an early video that I did about how animals come across in medieval or early medieval texts from England. It seems like animals are all viewed as having their proper place in the world, their proper habitat. And if an animal diverges from its proper habitat, it's seen as an imposter. Some strange animals like beavers and pond skaters bridge the gap between habitats, but if you take certain animals out of their habitat, they'll die. If you take a fish out of water, it dies quickly. And the Seafarer really reminds me of this imposter aspect of medieval cosmology. And from that angle, you could analyse this in a load of different ways. Maybe the most obvious one being that the Seafarer is an imposter on the sea, and that's possibly why he feels so uncomfortable and so unsafe. And that wouldn't be miles away from a modern Anglophone perspective on this. We might feel uncomfortable in a small boat on the sea because you can die at sea. If there's a storm, your only safe haven is the boat, and if you go in the sea, then you'll drown. And fundamentally, I think this discomfort is probably the same for him. He knows he'll die if he falls off the boat or if the boat sinks. But the way that's framed is potentially more, this isn't somewhere I'm supposed to be and that's why I feel anxious. And then that's all turned on its head when he describes his discomfort as the weather gets warmer. So maybe he believes that his place is on the sea and that certain people belong on the sea and that's where they're meant to be. Or maybe he believes that people should go to places that they feel like they're imposters and that people should look for that danger. Then after the cuckoo signalled the start of summer, he goes more into the Christian aspects of things and how it all links to heaven. But rather than focusing on heaven, initially he focuses on how he'll be remembered. Fordon bydd eula Jehuam after quelendra, lof liviendra, last worda betst. The best last word, the best epitaph, is that other people say good things about you after you've died. The impression you leave on other people is more important than how much comfort you're able to live in, or how many nice things you could afford to have in your grave, at least according to the poem. And this kind of sentiment shows a kind of duality in attitudes that's maybe recognisable today, although obviously we don't know the fine-grained cultural detail of how this was thought about. It shows that some people thought that your actions were more important than your wealth, and that's what the speaker seems to be saying. And it also kind of implicitly tells us that there was a widespread view that wealth was the most important thing. Why would this speaker make a point of saying that actions are more important than wealth if a significant number of people didn't think the opposite, or at least behave like they thought the opposite? So through poems like this, you get information about what the author thinks, and you can also learn things about how their thoughts are subversive. And on that note, I think there's an important point to be made about stories in general. I think in this case the speaker does seem to be trying to get some kind of point across, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that every story from every culture has got some kind of deep underlying point or some deep significance. Of course we can always take significance from it as readers, but it wasn't necessarily intended. This is a very ecclesiastical poem. The kinds of stories that might have been told around hearths or around tables might have ranged from very dramatic and meaningful to a bit funny and not much else. But anyway, that's not about this story. This story in particular does read like it has a message, at least to a modern reader. And it ends with this musing about heaven and the afterlife, this sort of almost kind of prescriptive sort of rallying to the person reading it or listening to it to live a good life. And then at the end it says Amen, whose meaning is probably clear enough. One of the issues with the Seafarer is that it doesn't actually explain what it is. There's no blurb, there's no synopsis, and it's usually interpreted as a reflection on the life of the speaker, who may or may not be a real person, who may or may not be an old person about to die. There's no way of knowing, really. Some people, like John Pope, have even argued that the Seafarer contains two separate speakers, although that was a controversial idea that he publicly retracted a few years down the line, and said he was probably wrong about it. But a lot of the discussion about it has been on early medieval ideas about the soul and the self, which are both integral to the poem. The man is alone, and he's talking about his soul travelling over the sea. This is one of several pieces of early medieval literature that deal with aloneness. And aloneness, I think, must have been understood differently then to how it is now. So for one thing, I think it was probably more of an occupational thing. I think most people watching this video understand what it's like to be on their own for a reasonably long period of time without human activity around them. But that's not necessarily true for the average early medieval person. Most of them would have fallen asleep and woken up in the same room as sort of at least 2 or 3 other people. A lot of work has to be done by several people at once. And on a more psychological level, you can imagine a kind of hyper-village mentality where everybody basically knows what everyone else is doing. Everybody is tuned into this social web, and if any of the fibres of the web are disturbed, everyone probably becomes aware of it very quickly. The cultures that most of us live in are fairly unique historically in the extent of their individualism. That's not a particularly normal thing cross-culturally. So for this person to say that they enjoy being alone in that way is possibly more of a subversive, dramatic statement then than it is now. And it adds to the idea that he's at the most uncomfortable end of the human spectrum. He's not only in an environment humans aren't supposed to be in, but he's also separated from other people. That analysis was not too deep, but hopefully it's a way into the poem for people who haven't read it before or haven't enjoyed it much before. Thank you for watching this slight detour of a video, and I'll talk to you soon.